if you have any kind of education at all, even if you are a high school dropout, even if you're a primary school dropout, probably at some point you had a conversation with a teacher, a professor, a parent, or a grandparent that went like this. Yeah, but they had democracy in ancient Athens and ancient Rome. Oh, but that doesn't count because they had slavery. Conversations of this kind, at various degrees of erudition and seriousness, you even see in formal Communist Party literature, talking about the meaning of democracy in different periods of history, to what extent the lessons of democracy, as exhibited in ancient Athens, ancient Sparta, ancient Rome, you name it, can and cannot be applied to the modern world today, whether it's in Europe, Asia, or what have you. The contrast between slavery and the lack of slavery is really not nearly as challenging as dealing with the contrast between polytheism and atheism. That's very, very hard to deal with. The extent to which the religious mentality and the role of religion in daily life in forming people's attitudes, their sense of public engagement and responsibility. Put it this way. It's not too terribly disturbing to me at all if someone were to suggest that the model of democracy presented to us by Athens had limited applicability to our society today because of slavery. Slavery was of tremendous economic significance in understanding ancient Athens, but that really does not cut very deep to me. But if someone makes the argument that the attitudes, responsibilities, social roles, even education, and so on, of people in Athens were so profoundly shaped by religion that the example, for better or worse, of Athens and how it functioned, any of those ancient city-states, for just Athens to name one, that example really, we can't learn anything from it that applies to our society today. Unfortunately, that cuts very deep indeed. And the more you know, the more disturbing that possibility becomes. Part of the problem is that so much of what we know comes from outrageously skeptical sources. Somebody like Aristotle, somebody like Thucydides, these authors, even Herodotus is more appreciative of religion than the other two authors I named. But all of these people were really very skeptical kind of cultural outsiders within Athens. And they, at the very least, they do not praise the role that religion had in their society. And to some extent, they even want to minimize it and sweep it under the rug in giving an overly rational and even, I could say, social scientific account of their society and how it works. Social scientific in the sense of the social sciences as we have them today. Now, the antidote to this comes in the legacy of Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges. I have absolutely no notes for this video except the full correct name of this author. Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges is without doubt in the top 10 list of the most important authors in the history of the modern Western reappraisal of the significance of ancient Greece and Rome. His book was unbelievably influential for a period of more than 50 years, let's say, and now it has started to be forgotten, partly because anthropology as a discipline moved away from those questions, and partly because the classics, the study of Latin and Greek themselves, have just kind of wilted in their importance or their prominence. Now, Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, his work on the importance of religion in Greece and Rome, he very much presumes that his reader is as conversant with the primary sources as I am, or even more so. I read this book simultaneously with my rereading of Thucydides And Thucydides is, I would say, his most important source, interestingly. Many, many, many of the anecdotes come primarily from Thucydides, to some extent from Plutarch. But he will present to you a completely one-sided version of an event in Thucydides, where there's a more nuanced telling of the story in the primary source. And I had this very fresh in my mind, so I was really aware of the extent to which Numa is dramatizing the ancient sources he's pulling from. So there's a really interesting twist in the plot in the description of the war between Sparta and Athens, written by Thucydides, where there's an army of Athenians who end up marooned on an island, and they have to escape for their lives. I'm keeping this brief, people. And they say, okay, we've lost this battle, we've lost this part of the war, we've had a series of defeats. We got to get in the boats, and we got to escape and go home or go somewhere, get away from this battlefield. And then there is an eclipse. And as the story is told by Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, his version of the events, he describes this whole situation entirely in terms of the Athenians being people terrified by superstition, totally preoccupied with a supernatural view of the world, and that they decide that they have to remain on this beach. They can't get in the boats and escape for a magical number of days. I believe it's 3 times 9 days. They decide they have to stay for 27 days. There's a magical number in order to satisfy the significance of this prophecy that the gods are dissatisfied with them, that this lunar eclipse has some tremendous significance. And all of them either die or are enslaved as a result. The results are absolutely disastrous. That really was their last chance to escape with their lives. This is many thousands of soldiers, fully armed and fully equipped. They could have also continued to play a strategic role in the war, and instead they're completely wiped out because of their superstitious response to this eclipse. Now, that's one lesson to take from that story. And he relates a debate that leads up to this disaster, a debate in Athens, in completely supernatural terms. He insists that the question of whether or not they should invade this island, whether or not this battle should happen, he presents it entirely in terms of different soothsayers, different supernatural interpreters of signs, debating what the gods do and don't want in these public forums. And he's really making a very hard case. He's saying what we think of as democracy is not democracy at all. Now, obviously, it's not secular democracy, but he's going much harder and much further than that, saying, no, modern people are imposing modern secular notions on this process. But even sticking with this same anecdote of these defeated soldiers on the beach, there are other lessons you can draw from this. Their commander, the man in charge, he wants to escape. He wants to flee. And it's the men, they vote for it, that they want to stay. Now, their reasons for staying are linked to supernatural interpretation of this eclipse, of something that this is true. However, in what other culture in the history of the world do the men in the army, do the lower ranks make that decision? Does the majority rule even in those circumstances? The beginning of the war as a whole and this particular expedition, the fact that it was debated and voted on, that's already of tremendous significance. And even this particular example, again, I could give details, but I think it's kind of productive. One of the sides in the debate is Alcibiades, who I've discussed in other videos. We should probably do a book review. There's a new biography of Alcibiades that's been written in English. You'd be interested to know more about this. And Alcibiades was basically chased out of Athens for being an atheist and a heretic. Alcibiades was a student of Socrates who was himself executed, ultimately, for being some kind of freethinker and heretic and so on. If there's one person we know does not believe in the conventional religious rites and superstitions of Athens, it must be Alcibiades. And Alcibiades apparently came into this debate And he says, well, you guys have your soothsayers, you have your interpreters, your augurs, your interpreters, but I brought my own. He's very wealthy, so in order to have the other side of the debate, that it was arranged for some other people to interpret the portents in a different way to have this. So even no, I mean Numa, the author, he's cherry picking examples that will favor his case. But even when you look at those same examples, these most extreme examples, there are other morals to be drawn to this story. There was something really special about a society where these things got interpreted, debated, and voted on by a plurality of voices. That did not happen in Catholic Europe in the Dark Ages. That did not happen, and it still does not happen in Saudi Arabia today, or in any Muslim society, where you say, okay, well, the majority is going to vote on this. Let's bring together all the citizens, and you people interpret the will of the gods, plural, or God singular in this way, and these people. And obviously also in these situations in terms of war, they did also discuss strategy and tactics and even economics, the money behind the war effort and so on and so forth. But what Numa is doing here, as I say, he's really trying to provide an antidote to a problem that is in part in the ancient texts that we rely on, and it's in part in our eyes as readers. So just very briefly, I already mentioned this. Somebody like Thucydides is already such an unusual, such an extraordinary intellectual, secular thinker, iconoclast in his own society. Same for Aristotle. Aristotle was almost killed in Athens too. Long story, I discussed that in an earlier video. He had to flee. In the end, he had to flee for his life, so that he didn't end up dead like Socrates. The types of voices that we care about, because there are other voices. You could read some other sources from ancient Athens. The types of voices that we really respect and value that came out of the society are not representative of the typical religious and superstitious values of that society. Not even Herodotus, who's more appreciative of popular religion. But it's very easy. I can remember this when I was younger. It's very easy for a modern reader to just skip over the mentions of religious aspects of daily life in Athens, or the role of religion in even these public forums, these democratic forums. It's easy to skip over them the same way that when you read Shakespeare, you may just ignore figures of speech. In Shakespeare, you have God's blood said. It's an unbelievably evocative curse word that comes up, and you have these religious turns of phrase that reflect even just swearing, and oaths, religious oaths and religious religious values and religious statements in Shakespeare, and we kind of don't let that slow down or change our appreciation of Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or any of these other major plays. We just kind of get into the mind of skipping over the religious content that comes up. Actually, with Hamlet specifically, that really can be a problem. The plot of Hamlet very fundamentally doesn't make sense if you don't understand just how, now I would say not just how Christian, but even Catholic a lot of the characters in that are. And that's a problem because at this time, Catholicism is a minority religion in England. But anyway, whether it's specifically Catholic or broadly Christian, maybe that's more than one interpretation of the play. And more than one interpretation of Shakespeare as an author too, by the way. But anyway, you do have to appreciate the role of religion in those plays to really understand them. But it is very easy to skip over the mention of people making oaths in front of the hearth fire, of them personifying and truly believing that the fire is watching them. That the fire is alive and has a mind and knows their sins and imperfections. They have to apologize to the fire. Stuff like that comes up in ancient Greek literature all the time. It's really easy to just gloss over it. You may not even be aware of the extent to which you're just skipping over outrageously impossible to imagine levels of superstition, views of the world that, again, today we can't relate to at all. And Numa really draws attention to that. and says, look, this was a society. He has hundreds of examples where in the middle of a war, men would leave the battlefield and go home because they had to perform some ritual in front of a fire. It's like, oh, sorry, this is the day when my clan, we have to go back. Oh no, it's just a higher priority. And where this has come up repeatedly, especially with the Spartans would stand there and die. They'd have arrows and javelins being thrown at them, and they wouldn't defend themselves until a religious ceremony was completed. And they wouldn't begin the march at the start of the war until the moon was in its right phase and the religious ceremony was completed. Like, the levels of superstition, war is the most extreme example because there's fear for your life. Like, you don't have to be skeptical to say, hey, they're already shooting arrows at us. They're already throwing javelins at us. We got to fight back. And, no. You wait until this chicken sacrifice is done and they've interpreted the liver and kidneys of the chicken. That's what it was about. It's almost all fixed this. Okay. So it's a really powerful book. It's a really important book. And I don't think this is the last YouTube video I'll make on it. I think I have to make at least one more YouTube video discussing it. The problem is the book can only be read by someone who is at least at my level of familiarity with the primary sources. Because the book is lying to you constantly. And that reflects a very different culture of what it means to be an historian. I had a colleague in Sanskrit, so history of India, but especially his PhD was in Sanskrit. And I remember I was taking issue with him and taking issue with some other. I said, look, this is kind of telling 30% of the truth and concealing 30% and lying about 30%. How can you? And I remember he said back to me, he said, well, the author is making his case. That was his attitude, was that it was acceptable to have a really high level of duplicity in quote unquote making your case for the reader, like as if you're a lawyer presenting a court case where the lawyer's job isn't to tell the truth. The lawyer is to either defend his client or, if the lawyer is on the other side, to make the client sound as bad as possible. Well, I don't accept that. Now, I just say, to me, it's utterly unacceptable. And it's a real shame because who today would make the argument that Numa makes? His fundamental argument is that these societies were much more alien from ours than we imagine. And not because of slavery, not because of something simple like that, because of the complex role religion played in the formation of the family, formation of tribes, the tribal structure within the community, in the formation of the city itself, in politics. And that democracy, as we conceive of it, he says, is not even really applicable. So I'm going to read you a short quotation here, and this shows just how far he takes it. He says, quote, "It is a singular error, therefore, among all human errors, to believe that in the ancient cities men enjoyed liberty. They had not even the idea of it. They did not believe that there could exist any rights as against the city and its gods. We shall see further on that the government changed form several times." It went through revolutions. There were revolutions changing the government, while the nature of the state remained nearly the same, and its omnipotence was little diminished. The government was called by turns monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, but none of these revolutions gave man true liberty, individual liberty. To have political rights, to vote, to name magistrates, to have the privilege of being archon, this was called liberty, but man was nevertheless enslaved to the states. The ancients, especially the Greeks, always exaggerated the importance and above all the rights of society, and this was due to the sacred and religious character with which their society was clothed. So I've shortened it only briefly. He is making the case that this society was not democratic at all. And he's wrong. It's a really important argument. It's really stimulating. I think it's really worthwhile, if you've already done enough reading to appreciate it, to be challenged with the jarring recognition. Like, for me, most of the sources he's quoting I've already read. Like the stuff he's quoting from whether it's Thucydides or Plutarch or Aristotle, whether he's quoting it or paraphrasing it, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. But like, I was much younger when I read many of these sources. I never took the step in my mind's eye to really think what it would be like to believe that the dead are still alive and present in the soil, in the city you're living in, and that they are literally attending the debates in Parliament. This is not really Parliament, but in your democracy. That they are literally present, witnessing that, judging that their vote is in a sense being counted through these religious rituals. Well, that changes your idea of democracy. When the dead ancestors and gods, very different idea of gods, when those people are really felt as a palpable presence. The animal sacrifice is unbelievably gory, unbelievably wasteful. It's genuinely horrifying. But what's more horrifying to understand is that these people lived lives in a state of constant fear, of dread. They were truly afraid of supernatural punishment. And this inspired them also to superhuman levels of bravery and self-destruction. It inspired them to, in the middle of the night, climb over the city wall into the enemy's city, go inside their temple, and steal the statue of their god, and then come back to their own city and say, now we'll win the war because we've got their god, because their god is on our side now. Again, this may seem like a prank, a frat boy would play. This may seem like a joke. What Numa is challenging us with is to say, no, it's no joke. Really take the time to think about how different the world would look and how different democracy would be and how different all these concepts would be if you really were a person who, with zero irony, understood yourself that way, understood your role in society that way. And when I was 19 years old, I was not capable of using my imagination to that extent. I say all the time, sympathy is an analytical tool, but to sympathize with the religious mentality of someone in that polytheistic society, their fears, their dreads, their bravery, like even in English, it's a weak concept now. The idea of the civil service, what we're talking about with the tremendous level of devotion and passion for democracy, for the demos, for serving the city in Athens, obviously in large part is literally a cult of ancestor worship. They're not even serving their fellow man in terms of the other people who happen to be alive. And they say that all the time in their speeches. And again, we kind of skip over it. Just like religious pleasantries in Shakespeare. All the time they say, we're gathered here for the spirits of our ancestors. These kinds of things are woven into the fabric of these speeches. And they literally sacrificed animals and had augury and interpreted the movements of the birds and the heavens before starting these speeches. And then the speeches, they're referring to these ghosts as very much present in the ongoing discourse. That, that civic virtue was religious virtue. And then the concept of what's civic and what's religious and personal responsibility and democracy, it's profoundly shaped by those very alien assumptions. So guys, Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, I don't think any of us would feel intimidated in trying to reproduce the virtues of ancient Greek democracy in our times because we lack slavery. That would be laugh out loud funny. Let's just say you have a department in a university. You say, hey guys, you know what? I'm tired of this department being run as a dictatorship. Most university departments are. Most offices are. Let's say you have a paper company. You know what? This office, we manufacture greeting cards out of paper. I'm tired of this being a dictatorship where this one guy's in charge. Let's reorganize it on the principles of ancient Greek democracy. On that scale, you could do it. You could get out Aristotle. You could look it up and say, okay, let's get organized, guys. Nobody would say the problem is we don't have slaves. Nobody would see that as an obstacle. And yet I think what Numa is drawing our attention to is there is a very real sense in what we can never have, what we can never harness, is exactly this passion this passion for the city that was in large part this untranslatable, utterly superstitious worldview that was harnessed by democracy, and yet also, in a perverse sense, held democracy in its thrall.